Good afternoon and welcome back. I hope you've enjoyed your lunch and the exhibition and the innovation stage and the knowledge stage as well. We're now moving into our afternoon plenary session. We have first a keynote speech from the President of the Association of Directors of Social Services, and I will introduce Sarah properly in a moment. And then we have a panel of three colleagues who are going to each share some thoughts around the overall topic for this afternoon's plenary session, which is integration in action. And the panel session will also be an opportunity for yourselves to ask questions. And there are two ways to do that. There will be people wandering around the room with paddles rather, a bit like table tennis paddles, that you can put your hand up and they will give you one of those, and we will call you with a microphone to ask your question. So please do start thinking now as you listen to the various presentations if there are any particular questions that you want to ask by way of follow-up or to widen the discussion. And the other route is by the app, and the app's now gone, but I'm sure whilst you've been sitting there you would have used the code to download the app if you've not already done so. And the app has within it a question and answer function, and just look for the main auditorium part of the listing for questions, and then the second of the two sessions, which is the integration interaction. And again, that just allows us to gather questions, and you can see what other questions people have been putting in as well that way. So that's our plan for the plenary session this afternoon. And the first speaker, our keynote speaker for the afternoon, is Sarah McClinton. She, as I said already, is the president for this year of the Association of Directors of Social Services, and she is also the Director of Health and Adult Services in the Royal Borough of Greenwich. And very much looking forward to what you have to say, Sarah.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul, and good afternoon, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity of joining you today, and it feels like there's a real buzz around. It's really exciting to see everybody and see the kind of world of possibilities for all our future. Yes, I'm the president of the Association of Directors of Adult Social Services this year. My day job is Director for Health and Adults in Greenwich, in South East London, and as part of that role, I lead the Healthier Greenwich Partnership, so leading on integration, so the conversation I'm really particularly interested in terms of the power of digital technology across our health and care systems. So I was just going to start with a little bit of context and background, really. So talk a bit about some of the current issues in adult social care, what keeps me awake at night, which is quite a lot actually at the moment. And that's predominantly around people not getting the care and support they need, some of those workforce issues and resources. So I'll say a little bit about those. But then hopefully, cheering us up a bit, I'd like to share some of the findings from the ADAS-TSA Commission that was published a couple of years ago, because I think there's some really important principles in that and key things that we need to look at in terms of taking things forward. And then I'll come on to some challenges and opportunities and a more positive think about the future. So the first thing that worries me is really the position we're in, where people aren't able to access really high quality care and support when they need it. So people not being able to get the right support at the right time in the right place. And often people are facing particular crises or changes in their lives and really in need of help, and yet we have 500,000 people across the country who are waiting for some sort of assessment or for care and support arrangements to be put in place. And that number, that comes from the ADAS survey that we did, which is about 6 months ago. But I think having looked at what's happened over this winter, I can't imagine that has improved or the numbers of people reduced in any way. And that was a significant kind of increase on the the work that we'd done 6 months earlier in November 21. So that's of huge concern to us all. The other thing that our ADAS survey showed was that councils had really stepped up in that period. So councils were providing more and more care into people's homes. And it's gone up about 17%. However, at the same time as more and more care was being provided, councils really just couldn't keep pace with the needs of people and the amount of care that people needed. So over 1 million hours of home care, that meant, couldn't be delivered, primarily due to workforce shortages during that period last year. And again, that was a really significant increase on the data we'd had for a similar period in the previous year. So over this winter, we've had a huge amount about people in hospital, people not being able to transfer from hospitals and not having sufficient capacity in social care in order to enable people to move into back home, ideally, or into another setting. I think the third point, really, just to emphasise, is the levels of complexity of need and how that is driving a lack of capacity, but also the fact that more and more people, the size of packages for individuals has grown really substantially. And I think what underlies this is that the boundaries between the NHS and social care can become very blurred, and more is expected of our social care system. So we only have to look at the latest 360 from the King's Fund, where they do this annual report of what's happening in social care. And that showed this year that more care was being provided, but to fewer people. So that's in the context of a growing older people's population, increasing needs in terms of disabled people, people with working age adults. We've seen huge increases in mental health need, particularly following the pandemic. But so what that means is that lower levels of care and support, that more preventive service, or people even with needs that are not insignificant, are really being squeezed out, and we're struggling to be able to provide for those sorts of needs. So one of the underlying issues in terms of capacity is simply not having enough pairs of hands to be able to support people. So last year, Skills for Care showed that there were 165,000 vacancies in registered adult social care, and that was a 50% increase on the previous year, so a really significant shift there. And we know that the turnover rate of staff is something approaching 30%. So even as quickly as we're able to recruit people, retention has always been a really significant problem. We know we find it really difficult to compete with other sectors, and that difficulty is becoming more and more intense. So we have competition from retail and hospitality. People can earn more in working in pubs or in supermarkets. And if I just take Tesco's, for example, they've increased their hourly rate 3 times within the space of a year. People are also able to access free food and discounted shopping. So in the context of a cost of living crisis, you can see how these jobs can be much more attractive than working in the social care sector. We've also got then competition with the NHS, and as care workers become more skilled, they're very often attracted to NHS roles, where pay and conditions for an NHS Band 3 will be significantly higher than most care workers are able to achieve. We've seen recently strikes and big conversation about pay in the NHS. That as that all becomes settled, that is really only going to increase the pressures in social care and increase that differential in terms of people who are often doing very similar jobs. If you're working, for example, in a community hospital with people with dementia, that's not going to be very different from working in a nursing home, in a social care service for people with dementia. So often people are doing very similar roles, but the levels of pay and also those terms and conditions are going to be significantly different. And then thirdly, we've seen the impact on unpaid carers. So those people who are providing more than 50 hours of care per week is now over 1.5 million. So that's family, friends, partners, unpaid carers, often having to fill the gaps, and that then has an impact on their own health and well-being and impacts on our broader systems. We've seen some media over the weekend about the NHS workforce plan, obviously some wrangling going on there with Treasury, but as ADAS we've been calling for a fully funded workforce plan for adult social care, and that's about the whole range of roles across the breadth of social care. It's about thinking about what are the roles that we might need for the future, and it seems very short-sighted to have a workforce plan for the NHS without really thinking about social care alongside that and where some of those roles might need to overlap. It's a bit of a Venn diagram, I'd suggest. But it really doesn't seem to make sense to ignore the social care workforce planning. So moving on, I think we know the other underlying issue really is money. And over the last 3 years, our ADAS surveys have shown directors having reported cumulative savings of 1.8 billion to adult social care budgets. That's really significant. And this is at a time of, as I said, growing older people's population, growing needs of disabled people and working age adults, so much more needs and expectations in our populations, and yet the resources that we have now are barely reaching the levels that we had, they're barely over the levels that we had back in 2010. So we're seeing the impact of that underinvestment over a decade or more. Having said that, the autumn statement was very welcome, and there was some funding, which is, as I say, welcome, but broadly what that does for adult social care is going to cover inflation and some of those demographic needs, but it's not going to do more than that. We've had a whole policy around what's a fair cost of care for providers. Much work has gone into that. Again, that's kind of raised expectations and set people to look at what that might be. It was a complicated exercise, but actually the autumn statement money, given the inflationary climate that we're in, is really helping us to stabilise and to stand still at the moment. So it doesn't address those decades of underfunding that we've experienced. And then just going into next year, it's worth noting that 3/4 of directors have either partial or no confidence that their budgets will be sufficient to meet their statutory duties. So that's the whole range of statutory duties across the Care Act, which includes support for people's health and well-being, as well as Mental Health Act and other duties that we have. So that's the situation that we're in terms of our context. But what I wanted to do really was just talk a bit about the joint commission that ADAS and the TSA did, which was published in March 21. But I think it was an excellent piece of work, some really clear recommendations, and I think they really are still our guiding principles in terms of thinking about the way ahead and how we make use of the opportunity afforded by digital technology. And I think we're all clear, given the context I've set out, that the future has to be different. And there's a huge opportunity for us to realise that and to unleash the power of technology as part of that. So the first, I think, principle, which is really important, is that technology-enabled services need to be proactive and they need to be co-produced. And we've seen lots of brilliant examples and conversations about co-production already today. But actually, the offer has to be really rooted in what people need, what people can make use of in terms of their everyday digital technology, as well as those more specialised kit that's available. And that we have to do this in a way that is going to make sense to people and is really rooted in what they need and want. The second principle was around building, the need to build digital infrastructure, skills and approaches in social care, so that individuals and all of our staff can really maximise those digital opportunities. I know from my own authority that there's a real cultural shift that's required in a very systemic way, so that digital technology is one of the first things that practitioners think about when they're talking to people about what their needs are, what might help, and what might work for people in a very personalised way. So I think, that's really important that we build some of that infrastructure and those skills. Thirdly, it was about the fact that people must own and control their health and social care data and enable access to the right people, by the right people at the right time. So really putting people in control, and that opportunity for shared records is huge, but it needs to be done in a way that people feel confident, that their data is secure and shared in the right way. And it has to be used in a way that enhances people's experiences and their outcomes. And then finally, the need for more collaboration in care and support across all levels, so that services and policies are joined up and contribute to that wider well-being of individuals, people's families, and people's communities. So we need to consider those opportunities across health and social care, which we know can often operate in real silos, but in a way, digital technology is an opportunity for us to break free from some of those silos and to actually use the technology to join things up in a much more coherent and consistent way. So there are undoubtedly challenges to that. I think the capacity of councils, but also of some of the social care providers is an issue in terms of being able to assess what the opportunities are that can be provided by tech providers, and then how do we sort of work together to build something which matches the needs and aspirations of our communities and the people who we serve. So that means that we need to invest to bring together skills across the council, also with NHS colleagues and others. I know from my own council, for example, that having that digital expertise and having corporate colleagues across the council who understand and are really committed to this agenda is absolutely crucial. I think the second challenge, which is linked, is about the kind of culture, skills and expertise that we have at all levels in councils, and clearly a need to build that at all levels. So that includes working with our practitioners. So the kind of digital offer is the first thing that they are thinking about, but also innovative market shaping. So thinking about our commissioning in a way that really maximises digital opportunities. I think sometimes our commissioning works in silos and we think of this service and that service, but actually how do we think about all of our commissioning really embracing technology and those digital opportunities? And then leadership, I think, is also really critical, and we've been doing some work in ADAS with partners to develop that kind of digital leadership. But I think it's really also important that we're working with communities in partnership and working with providers as partners so that we can really value the expertise that there is around, build that expertise and make the most of the opportunities together. And then, of course, there are real concerns and issues around data security, governance and interoperability. And those include issues like cybersecurity, information governance, the things that you'll all be very familiar with. And those are real issues and lots of risks emerging. So, for example, a recent cyber attack on a social care provider meant that details of vulnerable children and adults actually were then sort of available through the dark web. So how do we mitigate those risks? How do we work with providers in a way that deals with those situations when they arise, but also tries to prevent those situations? There are, 17,500 different social care providers. Many of those don't necessarily have secure systems, so quite a lot of work that we need to do to establish the kind of standards and quality, which is inclusive of the whole sector. And then clearly there are lots of opportunities, but also challenges in terms of sharing our data across organisations. So that might be understanding population health data through the NHS, through the lens of the council, but also our voluntary and community sector partners or other government agencies like DWP. How do we really use the power of data and make best of the opportunities to share that across our organisations? And there are obvious sensitivities in relation to that. But I'd say the principles of sharing data has to be the right one, but it does require organisational and cultural change if we're going to do that in a way that's really systematic and which is safe. So let me come on then to the opportunities. And I wanted to share with you some of the findings of our spring survey last year, which I think does highlight there's a huge opportunity here. And directors indicated to us that most councils are taking positive investment strategies for both digital technology and indeed for new models in terms of housing, accommodation, and different models of care and support. And it'd be interesting to see, because we're currently in the process of our 2023 survey, which will be published in June. But I would expect to see this number increase. I think that there's huge commitment and energy and huge appetite in councils to really grasp what the opportunity is here. And those, I was just in the TAPI session at lunchtime. I think the opportunities around digital technology and new housing models, those things for me are kind of inextricably linked. And the power of technology really in terms of supporting different housing options and housing options that really enable people to live the lives that they want to lead in a place to call home is really vital. And I think tech plays a critical part in enabling that. So I'd say we need to shift the conversation from hospital discharge, which is an overriding narrative that we often hear in the media in relation to social care, and that opportunity to shift to thinking about more proactive and preventive care. How can we keep people happy and healthy at home? And digital technology offers us huge opportunities to do that. If we think about the state of both the NHS and social care, we can't continue on a model where people, as they grow older, are treated in a very kind of episodic care way, with multiple hospital admissions, and we know really poor experiences often in terms of what that pathway looks like. So we have to recognise the benefits that there are across health and care in keeping people well connected and able to live their lives much more independently. But also, we have to recognise there are opportunities in that crisis care and how we can think about proactive care for people so that when things do happen, there's a plan in place, which means that people don't necessarily have to go to hospital. And then I think finally, the opportunity is around how we work together in our integrated care boards, our integrated care systems, and the potential to use their data to really understand our populations, to use that understanding to shift that to that more proactive approach, but also to target our resources in different ways. If we keep doing more of the same, we're not going to resolve the kind of vicious cycle of crises and the world that we're in. So I think one of the most important things in all of that for me is understanding populations and understanding the inequitable access and experience and outcomes of certain parts of our populations and how we might intervene differently to really tackle those health inequalities. And data and digital solutions are really fundamental to that. So I was just going to conclude, because I think it's been really inspiring to see everyone here today, and to see that sort of common purpose, which has been a theme throughout all of the sessions, that there is huge potential, and we can all play a part in creating a future where digital technology not only helps with some of those issues of workforce and resources that I talked about, but is truly transforming and enabling older and disabled people to live gloriously ordinary lives, as the House of Lords Committee put it. So it won't solve all our issues in terms of workforce and resources, but it does allow us, I think, to really imagine new possibilities and new ways of offering care and support, which is truly personalised and meets the needs of individuals. So to end really just on a bit of a challenge to us all here, what role can we each play in harnessing digital technology to support people who draw on care and support to live those gloriously ordinary lives? This is all of our tomorrows that we're talking about, and we all have a part to play. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. And that's a really great question, which I might ask the panelists later on as well, in terms of how we can all play our part. So we're now moving into a panel discussion, and we're going to start with inviting our three panelists to come onto the stage and take their seats. I'm going to invite Matthew, Rhiannon, and Ros, and I'll introduce them more formally in a moment, to come and take their seats for our plenary session, for our panel session. So, what we're going to do now is begin to sort of drill down a little bit more into integration in action and some of the various learnings from people who are doing it in practice, and some reflections on what's been said so far in this conference. So, our first speaker is Matthew Wynne. He's the Chief Executive at Cambridgeshire Community Services NHS Trust and a Specialist Advisor to NHS England on community health. Over to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Paul. So, good afternoon all. Really delighted to be here with this really important set of areas to talk about that Sarah has so rightly described as really important to help us age well. Here we go. What I wanted to talk about was just two areas where the NHS is trying to get its act in order, is trying to get a unified, and I think we're being fairly successful about it for once, a unified care model that is now across the whole of NHS England. And some of you, if you read NHS England documents, if that is, will have noticed this year we published a document about recovering urgent and emergency care services. Now, normally that is a chance for everybody to switch off and go, oh, that's all about ambulances, it's all about A&E, harder, faster, that's how we solve these issues. Actually, the document is far more intuitive, intelligent, and talks very much about the whole range of interactions, including tech, including social care, including healthcare, and all the other determinants that kind of support people to avoid them, frankly, having to use the emergency care system. And these are the kind of 5 key areas that are in that document, all of which are important to the tech care sector: increasing capacity in the right types of care, growing our workforce. I'm not going to talk about discharge because Sarah's quite clearly said we mustn't. We need to talk about and change the narrative to be preventative and to support good health. A really important aspect that you will support and I will support, and we must talk about more, is how we expand our better joint and healthcare at outside, at home, not just outside the hospital, at home, wherever that is, and making it easier for people to access our care. So let me drill down into 2 or 3 of those areas, what that means, especially around the NHS aspect in terms of community healthcare. So we have lots of work, and many of you will have been involved in this, is improving support for people living with frailty. I'm going to come on to the universal support now that is in every single part of England around accessing urgent community response services so they can respond within 2 hours. Making sure we use better technology. I'm going to talk about virtual wards really quickly, hospital at home type intensive support, and then also the transfer of hubs and ensuring that care can be coordinated, which is where the tech world definitely comes into play. So, over the last 2 years, and we did start this during the COVID period, and therefore it started slowly but has really got great momentum, is that every part of the country now has services that will respond from the community within 2 hours, working 7 days a week, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. as a bare minimum. Now, that does mean that those services are able to respond in a very different way than they have done before, including to tech providers, pennant alarm companies, etc. And there are good, tried and trusted, well-researched, got over the information governance issues of those people working hand in glove in local areas to make sure that people get the response when they need it. If you are struggling with those areas, we have got people who can help and connect you with those teams, but that's the model where we need to make sure that there is a single point of access into every single area, and then importantly, a multidisciplinary approach, whether one needs a therapist, whether one needs a nurse, whether one needs a paramedic. That is the role of the multidisciplinary team to get that right and to crack on with it. I won't talk through this in detail in terms of the slide, but that's a schematic of how that policy has developed. So pre-pandemic, published as part of the NHS long-term plan, through to fruition, and we've just published some more information on getting our data right and ensuring that we're really clear that those services are delivering the needs that are prevalent in all of our local communities. That means about coordinating, doesn't it? That means about pulling things together. That is about connecting the local intelligence through to responding when an ambulance goes out but doesn't necessarily need to convey someone to hospital, and these people get involved in someone's life. My services in my trust are looking actively now with our acute colleagues and the paramedics about portable X-ray equipment, which is this size, for us to check whether someone's had a hip fracture, as an example, or to do a chest X-ray, which will mean that when the pendant alarm goes, someone really can't get up, you call either into the ambulance world or into one of our services. In the not too distant future, we will be taking out that type of kit to check, are they okay? If it looks like a fracture, we'll fast-track an ambulance. If not, mobilise them, get them up, keep them well, wrap support around them, and then hand over to ongoing care services, including fall prevention services. A hugely different type of approach than we have classically gone with over the years gone by. So this is about connecting people together. It is about making sure that your type of services and your type of data is now being fed into the shared care record, because it's a care record, it's not an NHS record, so that we can all be intelligent about what we're looking at, and it is about strengthening the access and making sure that the right people are getting the right support at the right time. Great leaps forward. The tech world, your world, as well as the social care and the healthcare world can only do this effectively together. For the last couple of minutes then, the other area, which I think is really important and gaining momentum all the time, is about us creating, again, across the whole country, infrastructure to support people with needs that then get even greater and need a much more intensive 24-hour wraparound care, which is the virtual ward/hospital at home. Definitions are up there. Documents describe this in detail if you want to go and have a look at. We have over 100,000 people in the last year now being supported by this type of care. Some of it's discharged from hospital at an intensive level. Some of it is moving increasingly into proactive care at home. And we have nigh on 8,000 virtual wards beds base. It's a bit of a misnomer about the beds. That means there are 8,000 people at any time in their own homes, whether that be a care home or their front door, being supported by this approach. The aim is for that to get greater and greater and for us to take more and more calculated, well-governed and interconnected risk. And I would say, finally, that that development can only be blended between digital work, tech work, physical work of people going into our own homes. And I think between the synthesizing of those three approaches, we will be successful in supporting more and more people over the coming months and years. Paul, over to you.
There we go, it's working. So thank you very much, Matthew. And I'll be encouraging colleagues again, please do think about the questions you might want to ask Matthew and our other panelists. So I'm going to introduce next Ria Matthews, who is the Integrated System Director for Hywel Dda, was that correct? University Health Board and Carmarthenshire County Council.
Diolch yn fawr, Paul. Prynawn da bawb. Mae'n fraint I fod yma heddi gyda chi gyd. It's a privilege to be with you this afternoon. It's really good to follow your presentation. I think if I could pinch that slide of the pyramid and put it behind me, actually, it would be a really good background to what I'm going to talk to you about today. So increasingly, we're reading more and more in the evidence base and in peer reviews that underpinning the case for technology-enabled care and rolling that out at pace and scale is the need for us to drive improving outcomes and quality for our populations. And I'm hoping that this real-world story today will demonstrate it. It's a story that starts from a personal perspective, but it is that personal experience that triggered our integrated care system transformation under my leadership as Director of Health and Social Care for older people and people with complex needs or who are living with frailty. My father was one of those individuals. He was frail, albeit he was living in a different local authority to the one that I worked in. Now, frailty in this context is defined as a state of vulnerability. It's usually, but not always, associated with age-related decline or older age per se. My father had progressive Parkinson's disease and very early dementia, but he was living his best life at home, surrounded by his things, cared for by his wife, with care going in once a day for personal care. And what mattered to Dad was that we supported him to remain at home and to avoid admission to hospital or care home at all costs, Rian. Of course, he had that lifeline, that ruby red pendant around his neck. Now, for us in West Wales, it is frailty associated with older age and the multimorbidity that contributes significantly to our urgent and emergency care pressures. And when I refer to urgent and emergency care in my integrated role, that's urgent health and social care needs. And as according to the Pareto principle, it's 20% of our population that is contributing to 80% of that urgent care demand. And for us in West Wales, the over 85 demographic is nearly 2% greater than the rest of Wales. And it's growing at 1.8% per year and won't stop until the midpoint of this century. Now, clinicians amongst you will know that people like my father have limited physiological reserves to manage minor stressors, which predisposes them at high risk to falls, a loss of usual function, and acute confusion. And these episodes may seem to appear suddenly. However, there are opportunities to anticipate and to prevent, working proactively to reduce risk of crisis and therefore reverse frailty escalating and actually reduce the need for ongoing formal care or increasing social care requirement and hospital admission. Now, our health and care system is too reactive in nature. It waits for our frail to fall or to decompensate, and it is this that places additional demand on hospital and social care services. More importantly, the reactive nature of our system is failing this population when we know what matters to them most is to remain in their own home and independent. And all too often, they end up in hospital, stranded, and requiring more formal care and support that they would have needed otherwise. Now, my mother always knew when Dad was a bit off. "So ven right, Rian," she would say to me, "he's not right." And I'd be able to call the local community team and intercept with assessment and intervention to avoid an unnecessary admission. Now, Dad was lucky. He never had to use his lifeline. He was able to live the rest of his days at home and died there as according to his wishes and in his own bed. And my experience with my father made me wonder, in my role as Integrated System Director in Carmarthenshire in West Wales, how could we scale a preventative and proactive approach for our frail and our pre-frail population in West Wales to improve outcomes like that for all? We had a fragile workforce, as we all do, and a paucity of multidisciplinary professionals. We also have a large rural geographical landscape to cover. Technology-enabled care had to be that solution. We had a local care line service with a team of call handlers managing the crisis calls as they came in. So my thinking, so what if, when we installed technology-enabled care, we undertook a well-being assessment for each client and determined what matters to them at that point? What if our technology-enabled care call handlers pushed out proactive, just checking calls to our tech population at a frequency determined by that assessment so we could intercept earlier? And what if the tech population could call our tech call handlers when they were worried or their family were worried, and that the tech officers could help them navigate that complicated health and care system for us to be able to anticipate what they need? And so our transformation journey began. Our Careline service locally became Delta Wellbeing, a local authority trading company 100% owned by Carmarthenshire County Council, with social care embedded in the company's DNA. Our aim was to turn a reactive response in service into a proactive one, from fragmented provision to integrated provision across the whole system, to move from a deficit model to an asset-based model, to move away from doing for to doing with, and offering the lowest amount of support possible to make sure that people retain as much independence as they could for themselves. To change our thinking and doing to actually knowing what matters to the population. And to use Paul's words earlier, to stop thinking widgets and to start thinking people. Locally, Delta Wellbeing provides a Connect service, which is wholly integrated with health and social care. Delta Connect is our bedrock. It is co-located with our salaried GPs, advanced paramedics, advanced nurse practitioners, physios, OTs, social workers, reablement, physicians associates, the third sector, all working together at the front door of our community, providing that one single point of contact. Fast forward then a few years, and we now have nearly 6,000 Delta Connect customers. The model has evolved as we learn. Delta Wellbeing officers are now our trusted assessors in hospitals. Delta Wellbeing officers are now in our emergency departments, identifying those who could be turned around with an alternative offer. They're also our community first responders. They are able to respond within that 1 to 2 hour intermediate care standard, and actually our timing to response is 31 minutes. So what, I hear you all saying. So in terms of our faller triggers through tech, only 6% of those are conveyed to hospital, and this year we've responded to 11,500 call-outs. Our ambulance conveyance rates have reduced by 40%. And that integrated approach has reduced care requirement in 65 to 85% of the cases where ordinarily they would have been heading towards 2 to 3 calls per day. And that's been achieved through offering them an alternative, a stay on the virtual ward, although we prefer not to call it the virtual ward because it's too medicalised. We prefer to call it our home first approach. And we've reduced the rate of social work referral by between 31 and 45%. And most importantly, our population values the service, with an 85% retention rate on Connect service ongoing. But 6,000 is only the tip of that iceberg. There are approximately 18,000 over 75s in Carmarthenshire, and ideally, we'd like to get to the 65-year-olds and over. So our focus now is how we mainstream at scale and pace. And we believe that a national focus on what matters may allow us to do this. Paul mentioned earlier that we have an epidemic of families distressed at wanting to do what matters for their loved ones. Currently, referrals in the main are coming to Delta Connect from GPs and social workers, the professionals, with a small proportion coming from families. So what if we could change that public discourse and society demanded preventative and proactive provision as much as they do their urgent and emergency care access? Finally, can we galvanise our efforts to do this? Can we support populations to unlock their personalised outcomes, to discuss what matters, and for us to deliver improved outcomes? My experience suggests that we can, and as leaders in health and social care, we hold those values central to all that we do. Diolch yn fawr i chi gyd.
Thank you very much indeed. And we're now coming to our last speaker, who is Ros Rawson, who is a non-executive director at Sheffield Teaching Hospital, also a director of the TSA, Community Interest Company, and former Director General at the Department of Health.
Thank you very much, Paul. Hello, everybody. As Paul said, I'm Ros Rawson and currently at Sheffield Teaching Hospitals. But today, I want to really comment on how can we make integration successful from the perspective of 20 years of working at board level in the NHS on making strategic change. And I sort of want to begin by thinking about the difference between making change in your local team as compared to making change across a place. And the improvement models that people use, I think, often don't take account of what it involves when you're working across many, many partners. In my experience, one of the best models to use has been the Institute of Healthcare Improvement, which is, I think, in healthcare recognised as one of the leading improvement bodies in the world, led by Don Berwick originally. And they developed a mantra about system-wide change, which was about will, ideas, and execution. When I listened to what Matthew said today, how Rhiann's described what the work that's been going on in West Wales, you can see some of those things coming into place. So when you think about integration, think first, is the will in place across all the leaders in the system? And I think you need to be precise about what that is. Integration is this sort of general word that can mean many different things to different people. The whole point about creating will is that you makes people, leaders, feel that the new ways of working are more attractive than the status quo, that the status quo is uncomfortable. And I say uncomfortable because I think this is where the personal gets involved. When I look at data, and data talks, it's really important that we base decisions on data, but I'm not sure that it makes me uncomfortable in the way that as a daughter, discovering that my father had fallen and been lying on the floor for 7 hours, whilst my mother, living gloriously with dementia but unable to act, just lay with him and gave him a cuddle, that made me uncomfortable, that made me distressed. And bringing that personal to work is what we can all do to make change happen. So when you're looking at how can we make things move faster in my area, how can I influence more people in my system, think about what is the will there. Do all the leaders, all the decision makers, all the people working at a local level have that shared vision, shared purpose, and shared drive about the status quo is not acceptable. This is not a comfortable place to be. We need to change. The second area that the IHI look to is about ideas. And I kind of think, if you've been to many of the sessions today, there are so many ideas, so many things that we can do. And I think just at a national level, the programme of work that Matthew set out described lots of things in practice that we can do. So there's plenty of ideas out there. There's more and more evaluation about how we can make change. So I feel that ideas are not the issue, but make sure you've got those, that people all understand what they are in your system. And then the final area is around execution capability. And I think sometimes there can be a tendency that the new bit doesn't get the same focus on execution that I know, say, working at being based in a teaching hospitals trust, you know, where we've got some very tried and tested execution around dealing with our elective weights, dealing with our A&E. But when we're setting up a new system, we almost need to double down even more on our execution capability. So very briefly, I think in terms of making system-wide changes, I'd like you to think about, as you go away from here, inspired by some of the stories you've heard today, thinking, you know, Rianne's story, the national context that Sarah and Matthew have set out, what is stopping you from making the big change, making the personalised, proactive, preventative care that you want in your system, but above all, I think that you want for yourselves and your families and your loved ones. Is it will? Is there the will there to make these changes? Is it ideas, or is it the execution capability? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Ros. So we're now going to move into a bit of a discussion and question and answers, and I think the lights will be turned up ever so more slightly so I can see people in the room. And there were going to be a few people wandering around with microphones. I think I promised paddles as well, but I can't see paddles, so we'll just have the microphones being handed around. And they are both looking for hands in the audience. So if you have a question you'd like to ask yourself, please do put your hand up, and we will start with an audience question. Then I have quite a few questions from colleagues that have come via the app, so I will then come to those. So do we have a question? Yes, please.
Hello there, I am Peter Zine, and we were talking about working together, but every time I do see that questions, but I think we need to communicate better. What are we talking about? Are we talking about social care and NHS to work together? And first, I need to say I am on direct payment myself, but they don't give us the control on that direct payment. They do say it is about giving people control, but it doesn't give me control to get what I need to get for myself, because most times we do the DAT data on service itself, what they can do better, but if we had more control for that budget, we don't need all that. I do understand some people, they need that support. Hello there, I am Peter Zine, and we were talking about working together, but every time I do see that questions, but I think we need to communicate better. What are we talking about? Are we talking about social care and NHS to work together? And first I need to say I am on direct payment myself, but they don't give us the control on that direct payment. They do say it is about giving people control, but it doesn't give me control to get what I need to get for myself, because most times we do the data on service itself, what they can do better, but if we had more control for that budget, we don't need them. And I do understand some people, they need that support.
Thank you very much indeed. And your question goes to the heart of, if you like, the TSA's challenge at this conference, which is how do we make personalisation real? How do we make these things meaningful for the person who at the end of the day is the person living the life? No one else can live the life for you. And I'm going to sort of turn that question back to our panellists here, because they've all had the chance to sort of reflect on the question you posed, which is partly about how do we make it real for a gentleman who just asked that question. A lot of what we've heard described today is very exciting, but it may well be very exciting for a technologically interested audience who are trying to deliver these types of service. But how do we also make sure that in the end the conversation is one where the person we're having the conversation with is in control, not just of the conversation, but actually of the outcomes that matter to them. So how do we do that? I'm going to start with Matthew.
Can you hear me? Yes. Well, I think there's a clearly part of the answer is that we still have this terrible divide between health and social care money, that especially when it comes around to personalised care. So your point about personal budgets, then the NHS is completely separate to that. Now we do have, and we have started to look at personal health budgets, but it's in the infancy compared to, I think what you're imploring us to do is to have a rounded, personalised care approach. I would say that we may, certainly in policy, money, and for the person, need to start thinking very much about those that need that from an ongoing care rationale. They need that care and they need that support on an ongoing basis. Most of what I described from the NHS is very much episodic. It is short burst deterioration of physical and healthcare needs that need an intervention to go the other way. But I take the point fully, and I'm afraid I don't have a great answer, except to say, of course, you're right. We don't have this built together in policy terms to actually say, can I build the total package around myself? I think there are solutions around the technology aspect that doesn't have to be alienating. I can think of one company we work with providing remote monitoring that set that up for the individual. It is completely separate to any local broadband, any means of yourself. It is completely self-encompassing, and therefore it is able to be used all over the place, as opposed to just those that are digitally savvy or have enough money to have a good broadband infrastructure. So all of those things are absolutely essential.
Thank you. And I might ask other colleagues to think about where personal budgets and direct payment fit into this, because the gentleman did talk about direct payments as being something that was relevant to him. Rhiannon, would you like to give your view?
In Wales, we have a slightly different direct payment setup, so I think I'll try and skew away from that and just again sort of base my answer on experience. I mentioned that quite a significant proportion of people that came to us for support ended up without having anything, or alternatives, I should say. And I think that's an important lesson for us all, because what we do, as I keep saying, is we ask them what the people want for themselves, what matters to them, and so they end up with a personalised package, which is often less than what we would as professionals have given them anyway. So I think that's the lesson from us, that often if we work with you, then we can not only give you a personalised package which suits you and your well-being and independence. I can see you want to come back in.
Well, you are giving that person choice. Do you talk about direct payment to give them that beautiful choice, or because you don't think it is good idea yourself? Do you stop talking about that direct payment? I did learn from my past some staff, if they aren't having passion about that thing, they don't talk about that to that patient. When you are giving that person choice, do you talk about direct payment to give them that beautiful choice, or because you don't think it is a good idea yourself, do you stop talking about that direct payment? I did learn from my past some staff, if they aren't having passion about that thing, they don't talk about that to that patient.
Direct payments are always offered from our perspective as part of that initial conversation. Does that answer your question?
Can I, sorry, yes, did you, yes.
No, I was just going to add,
Yeah.
I've worked quite a lot with Peter over the years, and Peter's working with us around designing our technology-enabled care service.
Right.
And just building on the question that Peter's just asked is around some of that culture as well, and the experience of of staff across health and social care embracing new ways of working, direct payments, technology, and offering that as part of personalised care and support. And I think the challenge we've got is very much around the culture.
Yeah. Ros, did you want to sort of both respond to that bit, but also pick up on the earlier part of the question?
I suppose I'd make a kind of more general point about if I have two hats on, one as a board member of a trust and one as a person. The real difficulty when you're a board member, you tend to be inundated with data about what's going on, but you don't really know whether you've met everybody's needs because everybody is different. Then when I spend a day with either people that are using our services or with staff, I can see that people present themselves with very different sets of expectations and needs, and that isn't reflected at all at the data that we see at the board. So, I mean, just last week I spent some time with our community midwives, and I was blown away by the way in which they really are talking to people about their housing needs, their financial needs, their employment rights, a lot of safeguarding issues. So they're doing a really big job. If I hadn't spent the day with them, I would have no idea at the board that was going on. And that was really significant for those women, probably for the life chances of their babies, that work was going on. So for me, I think what I can do as what boards need to do is to continually triangulate by listening to people, setting a culture where the expectation is that the care is individualised, so that we always are doing both. So I think it's never going to be a simple solution, and we all need to keep working at it.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the questions. Really, really great way for us to start this session. I'm going to go to a couple of questions that are on the app, and there are sort of a bundle of questions that relate to virtual wards. So I'm just going to sort of bring them together as one question, if I may. So a question from Stephen Boddington, which was, how do you envisage virtual wards blending in with your tech-enabled social care solutions to support proactive and preventative outcomes? Are there any good case studies? And then there's another question, which I now need to find again because the app keeps refreshing, which is, Matthew, is the virtual ward an urgent care team linked to your social care centre? And let me just give one other because I think it's worth, and I think these are ones maybe that can be answered by other colleagues who've got models as well. So let me just find the last one I thought was worth specifically asking in relation to this, if only the app wouldn't keep refreshing whilst I do that. Right. Whilst I'm looking, Matthew, would you like to start, and then I'll come to Rhiannon.
So the 2-hour response and virtual wards are, for me, two sides of a same coin. And I know in lots of areas, including my own organisation, we're blending that team to become one. So there's one team with the ability to respond quickly and then gradiate up the intensity of support an individual might need for a very short period of time. So, you know, in simplistic terms, a virtual ward is a level of intensity of support around the clock that you might previously needed to go to be admitted to hospital to get. We use tech to enable us to do that, but tech is not the only substitution. So the monitoring the person, I think tech has a major role. The caregiving is still really important in the face-to-face work. So I would say those two things blend together. I think the interrelationship with the tech industry, whether it be pendant, whether it be other remote monitoring, digital-enabled work at home, is probably to then be identifying those that are deteriorating, those that are giving concern, and then us moving into, in the NHS space, where it needs a healthcare intervention, either that multidisciplinary angle that needs rapid response within 2 hours, or indeed something that is more consultant, medically nursing, therapy-led, that is of a hospital-at-home scheme. That's an intensity question. Good local teams are making the connections, and I think if you're struggling to make those connections, the national team are here to help, your regional teams are here to help. In terms of good case studies, on NHS England, there's a site called the Futures, I think it's called the Futures Collaboration Site or something. You can go in there, search that on NHS England. You might need to register. There is a rafter of really good information. It's all the stuff that we don't put out the front door. All the interesting stuff is in that part of the website. Really good case studies, bound to be something that is about the interrelationship between what I've just described and the tech world.
And before I come to pick up the other bit, just to get the other thread into this conversation, and it's really partly a reflection. How do we, having seen the significant investment in virtual wards, particularly in England, but development in other nations in the UK, how do we make sure that investment genuinely then becomes a blended or integrated offering with technology-enabled care solutions? Not always the same cohorts of people, it can sometimes be different, but they are also overlapping. How do we make sure that happens? And the question I was struggling to find, but now have, was really, as this does develop, and we do have more integration between virtual wards, technology-enabled care solutions, it's potentially the case there will be a number of different solutions within a person's house. How do we manage that in a way that it doesn't become an inconvenience to the individual, I guess would be another question. So I'm going to start with just maybe to pick up on the earlier question and that, from your perspective from Delta Care, and then come back to you, Wynne, and then I'll maybe ask Ros just to sort of draw a few threads together from all of that, because we are rapidly running out of time.
So I think in Wales locally we're battling with that definition of virtual ward. We've used the words many different guises, I think, over the last 4 years. In COVID particularly, the virtual ward was how you asked for a case example. We used the virtual ward to describe those patients with COVID who were either discharged from hospital or we knew had COVID, so that we could monitor their oxygen levels in the home environment, and that was monitored by clinicians. The reason that we're wrangling with it is because actually a virtual ward is so much more than clinical monitoring in the home. And in Wales, we've decided only very recently that we're not going to call it the virtual ward, we're going to call it enhanced community care. One, it removes that medical focus again, but also it incorporates everything else that happens for us to be able to manage an individual's needs and support their well-being in their own home. So it's a combination of physical care and treatment, which could include acute intervention, whereas usually we normally would provide that in an acute setting, and we're able to provide that at home. But it's also care and support that is required at an intensity that is greater than they would normally. So a case example of that would be the type of, let's just say that we have an individual in the community who is receiving 3 calls a day with our long-term service, but decompensates, as I explained in my talk earlier. Generally, that call would come through to our single point of contact through Home First, so that we know that those needs are increasing. We would respond either by the Delta Wellbeing officers going out there and offering a bit of kit, but they would always be accompanied by additional physical care and support. So it's a combination of physical care and support as well as any virtual or tech monitoring that we can put in place. So that enhanced community care is and can be defined as more than what that individual usually needs, but can be remote monitoring and increased acute or physical care support and treatment. I think the only thing I would also say is that the assessment always tries to make sure that we provide safe alternatives to hospital admission or expedites discharge, but only when it's safe for us to do so. So we always make sure that we do an assessment of safety for that individual as well. So it's safe and appropriate alternatives in an enhanced care home, community care model.
Thank you. Matthew, did you want to pick up?
I mean, very quickly, when we produced the original starting gun guidance for care at home for the virtual wards, if you go to that document, there was a kind of there was the splitting out of where we thought indicatively the money should be spent. A proportion would have been on tech. The vast proportion was on people to do the work. Others were on enablers, etc. So I think, and I can't remember the ratios off the top of my head, and I don't want to give the wrong answer, but it's worth looking at that because that really guides where we thought actually the money would be invested in a local area. It is folly for the national team to insist that that happens, because it then completely takes out the whole point of local leadership and understanding it from your local perspective. I would say there are lots of, and just to talk about the difference between virtual wards and hospital at home, there are lots of really well-established and mature hospital at homes now. I was chatting to a nurse consultant who led one of the teams down in the southwest a couple of weeks ago, and she was just talking me through how they have matured over the years. Currently, 20 to 30% of people that are supported on their hospital at home virtual ward scheme die on that scheme. That means they're not dying in hospital. It's not because they're giving bad care. It shows the intensity of support that that team has now developed, supported by tech, but supported by great clinical care, to really change the way care is delivered in that area. And it means that they have a much bigger focus now on end-of-life care, because they are really focusing on the right amount of people and doing that terrible thing. I don't want my father or my mother to die in a hospital bed unless they are disastrously unwell and they die there as a consequence. If it's a deterioration, I want some alternatives. That's what mature schemes start to do.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ros, and then we'll need to wind up, I'm afraid.
So I've spent a lot of my career, it feels like, fighting for a bit of the NHS or care that hasn't had attention, whether it's been general practice or social care or community services. And I think virtual ward is a brilliant term to get investment where it should be, which is providing care for people at home or close to their home. Because whatever we think of it, the general public is very attached to the notion of hospital beds. And virtual ward as a concept kind of holds some of that concept whilst actually delivering the care that people really want, which, you know, we've said examples about how we want it to be at home. So I think this thing about when you're working locally, like you just described, Brianne, you kind of all need to know what you're talking about, but don't lose the term, because it really is, I'm sure, it's really probably going to be one of the ways in which we can leverage investment into a different place and out of some of these big hospitals, including my own.
And in there would be, I think, a really good debate about how we describe these things and how we engage the public with them in a way that makes them feel safe, reassured, and actually wanting to see the shift, and not necessarily waving the placards because there isn't a hospital available to them. And I think that's a really key thing. I would have loved to have got into a question about how we manage the debate about clinical risk and with whom the patient's risk is being held, because that is a real issue between community and acute services in some of these virtual wards. But we have run out of time. I think it's been really good to have 3 excellent presentations, and thank you very much for those who put in questions and we didn't get to them, and thank you very much for those who did actually ask some questions. Really were very helpful. Can you show your appreciation of our panel in the usual way? Thank you very much. That concludes our plenary session for this afternoon.